Welcome to this week's lesson. We continue with the land use planning process, and this week we focus on tourism. So we'll first look at the development of tourism in general before we start zoning in on Trinidad and Tobago. So tourism has frequently been perceived as the engine that drives growth of all kind and development in many areas, particularly in rural areas or poor communities. It is considered as a means to enhance economic development of those communities. So this is often a resource that is expected to be utilized to develop the economic resilience of a community. Ecotourism is also an appealing option in many undeveloped areas, that has an abundance of natural resources. So we define ecotourism as a responsible travel to natural areas that conserve the environment and sustains the well-being of the local people, and also involves the interpretation and education. So it is a holistic approach to tourism. So while you have the economic gain, you have that economic gain in a responsible manner, that the natural environment is not negatively affected. And of course this happens as a result of the knowledge and education of all those involved in this type of tourism as to the importance of the environment and an appreciation for the environment. So tourism development in general depends heavily on local residents for support. So typically you find the local residents would be the ones that would be involved in providing labor for all the different activities and responsibilities that would be required. The local residents also play a significant role in terms of making visitors feel welcome in their community. So a reasonable degree of consensus must take place between local residents and the business community, and this is essential for long-term success of tourism development in any area. So what we are looking at here is what we call Butler's model of tourist resort development. So this can be applied to any tourist community. On the left axis we see the numbers of tourists, and on the bottom axis we see this is time. So what we're seeing is we're looking at how the numbers of tourists over time in any tourist community would change and evolve. So at the beginning stage of any tourist development, this is the stage that's usually the most exciting. This is where you now have tourists coming into a community, discovering all the natural beauty and wonder of this community. And so this is the initial stages. Usually at this stage, this is when the locals in the community would be most enthusiastic and welcoming to the visitors. As time passes and the community becomes more well known, you have more tourists coming in, more visitors. You find more business development and business investment would come into the community, more facilities being built, restaurants, hotels, etc. And it continues on. We see at stage 3 now, this is where the economy has solidified somewhat, and numbers continue to grow. But then as it continues, we find we have a growing problem that begins to happen. You find the community reaches a stage where they begin to feel imposed upon. The natural environment will begin to deteriorate as numbers of visitors increase, and then we can now likely see a decline in that tourism development, and this decline will continue if there isn't some kind of intervention taking place. So we find that over time there would be changes in the physical and social environment that could result in the decline of the tourism industry in an area. Where we have too many tourists, that can place a burden on the community, as I said, both environmentally and socially. We find physical burdens on fragile ecosystem, such as we see right here in Tobago on the coral reef systems and coastal regions, as well as cultural impositions on the local populations, where, as I mentioned before, locals may begin to feel imposed upon when you have this increased influx of visitors into their areas. So if the residents of the host community perceive tourism as counterproductive to their welfare, you find that their attitudes would now become negative towards the tourists. Here we look at DOCSI's irritation index. So this has to do with attitudes and how attitudes change in relation to the development of tourism in an area. On the left, we have the different levels of irritation. We have a description of what the local attitudes would be, and on the right, it tells us the level that is connected to. So in the beginning, as I mentioned before, this would be a period of excitement. You find the level of, there will be little irritation at this level. You find an attitude of euphoria. This would be associated with the initial stage of development of tourism. You find a sense of excitement and anticipation. You have informal contact with tourists. So this is the exploration stage. This is the beginning. Then we move to a stage that we describe as apathy, where you have, this is a more formal contact with tourists, maybe as employees involved in the tourism industry, for example. Where the community is now beginning to see tourism as a source of income and investment. Level 3, we move to a stage of annoyance, where residents begin to show misgivings about the tourism industry. They're not necessarily seeing it as a constructive, productive thing anymore. You find that they feel this way due to the increasing numbers of visitors and increasing numbers of businesses coming into the community. However, at this point, this is when the tourism industry or the community, tourism in the community is now at its peak. It's most successful now at its peak. And then finally we reach a stage where the attitude is one of an antagonism, where the community is irritated. They express it in verbally and physically. Politeness gives way to antagonism. You find that the tourists will now begin to have bad experiences in terms of the way they are treated. The tourists are now seen as the cause of the problem. And this is the point at which the tourism industry will begin to decline. So what we find is intense tourism concentration on a destination area leads to negative attitudes toward tourism and tourists by the local community. However, the more dependent the people in the community are on tourism, you find they would tend to make more of an effort to have a positive overall attitude because they are dependent on it. So that's according to PISAM 1978. Then we also have community values and objectives that may change incrementally with the increasing tourism, as we saw before. The significance of incremental change is that it involves many decision makers who are interested in starting projects, not in halting development. So we find that we can have external pressures coming in, where you find not only business people but planners wanting to take advantage of this opportunity for economic growth by encouraging more development. And this places more pressure on the communities themselves, not only the people but on the natural environment. So you find community values and goals, you find, have not really been addressed traditionally. And this is very important. It must be identified. You must look at the social consequences of the different levels of tourism development, And you must take all of that into consideration. What does the community need? What are the things they value? So as we've spoken of before, as part of the land use planning process, any kind of development in any area, any kind of land use development in any area must have a holistic approach. You cannot be single-minded by focusing entirely on economics, or entirely on social needs, or even the environment. It must be an integrated land use planning approach. So where you have a community-oriented plan for development, this would always be preferred, to a business-oriented plan. So you must have some input from the community in terms of any tourism development plan. So what we're saying is there's a greater need for community involvement in the planning process. And we've discussed much of this before. We know that having community consultations and involvement, getting to know the needs of your community, allowing the community to have input in the decisions and the plans for their own community would oftentimes produce a plan that would be more successful. So effective tourism planning at the community level must serve to enhance the effectiveness of tourism for all parties. So all stakeholders must be involved, and having the local community involved is a critical part of the land use planning process. The private sector often tends to be more attuned to profit maximization than socioeconomic benefits. Therefore, a desired balance of development will not be gained unless you have government intervention on behalf of the resident well-being. So if you have a government that lacks the political power or will, implementation of an appropriate tourism planning policy will be difficult to achieve, because the government is supposed to be there. They have a mandate to serve the people. So if you have tourism development taking place without the involvement of the government, we will have problems. At this point, I'd like to ask you to please proceed to part 2 of today's lesson.